My American Eagle can go just about anywhere under the sun. Anywhere.
To the beach, the hard way. Eagle even hauls my boat out of this. Eagle's four-wheel drive automatically directs power for the traction to get out where there's nothing but woods.
The Eagle has landed on all fours.
When I picked up this Eagle, I knew it was going to be a bit of a project. When I got this, it was a complete running car. All it really needed was a battery. But I'm a complete lunatic who can't leave well enough alone, and I decided to take the thing entirely apart to restore and modify it. The only part of the drivetrain left in the car, as of filming this, is the rear axle, and that's going to come out at some point. I want this car to be done by its 40th anniversary, but I've got big dreams for it. There's a lot I'd like to do, so it's time to focus, time to get serious, time to knuckle down. I know the wheel bearings were done sometime in the past, but I have no idea how many years ago or miles ago that was. They're a little crunchy, but it doesn't feel like damage, more like old grease and grit. So I'm going to take these apart, re-grease them, and put some new seals in. This should be a pretty quick and easy job and a good way to get this project rolling. I began by removing the hardware holding on the brake caliper bracket. These are half 13 Torx head bolts. The bolt heads show some damage, which is pretty common for Torx bolts if the wrong size or type of socket is used on them. I should probably replace these. Next are the bolts holding on the steering arm. This arm is what the tie rod connects to. These bolts are hex head and also half 13. Though you can't see it under the grease and dirt, these are marked as grade 8. With both brackets out of the way, there is access to the 3 smaller Torx bolts holding the assembly together. So far, these are the only bolts that are properly tight. And they're actually in pretty decent condition, aside from some silicone in the threads. Interestingly, these are metric, M12 by 1.75, which makes them some of the very few metric bolts in this entire car, and probably the only ones in the suspension. With all of the bolts removed, the knuckle and bearing carrier should split apart easily, but the old silicone had practically glued them together. So I threaded in the small metric bolts and I used them to knock the bearing carrier away from the knuckle. The splash shield is sandwiched between the two and just lifts off. I knocked the old inner seal out of the knuckle. It's definitely seen better days. I then very carefully removed the O-ring. This is what seals the knuckle and the carrier together. Aside from a little silicone, it's in very fine shape, which is good because I don't have any spares. On top of the inner bearings sits a machined spacer, which fills the gap between the axle and the bearings when the axle is installed. In order to get to the bearings and the last remaining seal, the hub needs to be pressed out. Normally this would be done with a hydraulic press, but I did it by using the metric bolts and some old brake pads. Tightening the bolts causes the carrier to push against the hub, separating the two. After they separate enough, the inner bearing comes off. And that means the carrier comes off too, leaving just the outer bearing and the outer seal behind. The bearings taper toward each other, which means that when they're both installed, the carrier is locked between them. I snipped off the outer seal to give myself more room to work. Then I used a cheap bearing splitter to pull the bearing. The splitter was a little smaller than advertised, but I was too impatient and used it anyway. That was a mistake. I put several dents in the bearing cage. Though the damage looks minor, I'd rather just replace the bearing. Better to do it now while it's apart than have to do it later. But it gets worse. Along with the bearing, I also damaged the hub, and that's not so easily replaced. There's quite a few nicks and a couple of serious-looking gouges. Luckily, most of the serious stuff is not on the spot where the seal rides. On the actual sealing surface, there's just a few small scratches, which can be easily filled with some epoxy. After spreading it on and letting it cure, I filed down the excess, being very careful not to touch the base metal with the file. Then it's just a matter of sanding it down to a smooth, even surface. Good as new. Almost. I promised that when I started filming, it really was just going to be the seals. But, in for a penny, in for a pound. New bearings mean new bearing races. The old ones are pressed into the carrier, so they need to be knocked out with a hammer and punch. There we go. And the new ones need to be pressed in. But I need a tool for that. When installed, the inner bearing race sits flush with the edge of the carrier. But the outer bearing race is recessed into the carrier to allow room for the seal to press in behind it. So I need something that's wide enough to press on the edge of the race to install it, but small enough to fit into the carrier so that I can get it out afterwards. Traditionally, a large socket or length of pipe would be used, but I don't have anything that's the right size. Except, I do have the old races. I use the grinder to reduce the outside diameter, allowing it to slip into the hub without getting stuck. The new bearings were thrown in the freezer for a few hours, and the carrier was baked to a crispy golden brown. Heating up the carrier temporarily increases its inner diameter, while freezing the races temporarily decreases their exterior diameter. That reduces the overall interference fit of the parts and allows me to press them together with less force. I was prepared to have to run over to the hydraulic press, but the vise worked quite well and the new races went in fairly easily. With the carrier prepped, I took some time to wire wheel the hub and gave it a few coats of some satin metallic spray paint. I also touched up a few spots on the splash shield. Then I completely neglected to paint the carrier and instead moved on to the bearings. They were given a quick cleaning and then packed with grease, making sure to fill the cage entirely. The outer bearing drops into the carrier, and then the outer seal is tapped in behind it. It was a bit finicky to get started, but the modified race helped. Then it was fully seated with a few taps from an actual punch. The outer bearing, along with the seal and carrier, was pressed onto the hub. Once that was fully seated, the inner bearing was pressed on, which locks everything into place. And just like that, the passenger side is ready for paint and final assembly. Riding the high of a job well done, I jumped over to the other side to repeat the process. On this side, the steering arm was held on with 2 Allen head bolts, which, when removed, revealed some hidden damage, which I very carefully ignored. I separated the knuckle and carrier to find some very old and chunky grease, mixed with a thick layer of orange silicone. The O-ring which should have been on this side was long gone. And just like before, I separated the hub, knocked out the old races, and pressed in the new ones. That just left the outer bearing to pull, but I was not eager to repeat the mistakes of the past, so I resorted to capitalism. The ritual is not complicated, but there is always a price. Let us begin with something small, the remaining O-ring. Yes, the market was pleased with my sacrifice. But that was just a trifle. On to bigger things. Worth every penny. And just like on the other side, I packed the new bearings, installed the outer seal, and then pressed everything together onto the hub. The damage to the knuckle needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed properly, which is why I did the right thing and used some epoxy. If I had to guess what caused this kind of damage, I'd say someone drilling out a broken bolt. But what caused the bolt to break? And was the damage confined to just the bolt? Well, no. The steering arm is twisted, quite badly. But there is always a price. No, not again. That's enough occult for one day. Unfortunately, this kind of damage can't be undone. Trying to bend it back would only weaken it, perhaps even break it. But where there's a will, there's a way, sure. Oh, a way, sure. See, it's washer, but where there's a will, there's a way, so with the front bolt tightened down, the gap on the back is just about right for a little spacer. It's not square, but that's fixed with a little filing. Okay, a whole lot of filing. And with that taken care of, it's time to make this pretty. I used Rust-Oleum hammered finish with a bit of magic hardener added. Following the instructions on the can, 2 coats were applied several minutes apart, including on the bearing carriers, which I absolutely should have painted prior to installing. To speed the curing process, I rigged up an old 500-watt light and fan to run overnight. This paint turned out fantastic. It came out extremely hard and glossy. I really like the texture and the subtle metallic flake. And even though this is black and it kind of came out grayish, I dig it. Time to put it all back together. I replaced all of the hardware. For the metric bolts, I went with 12 points because they're stronger than grade 8 and they fit in the recessed holes very nicely. And for the brake bracket and steering arm, grade 8 hex bolts, the standard. And though there is a lot more left to do on this car, for now, I'm happy with this. Yeah, pretty happy.